And Professor Engel, do you see divestment playing a role?
Yes, I do see divestment playing a role, and I think I did actually mention in my opening remarks in saying that where you put your money, whether you invest it or not, is itself an ethical decision. So Professor Henderson is right. This is actually an extraordinarily complex question. We're talking about at least 200 companies that have all different kinds of investments. If you simply pull out your divestment, you're not going to hurt you financially, in all likelihood, at all. So what does divestment really do? What can it do? It can stigmatize certain companies. And that stigma that attaches to them, coal companies would be the first place to go. That stigma has a real effect. It can affect legislation. It can affect whether other companies want to do business with those companies. It can spread a great deal. The Smith School of Enterprise and Economics at Oxford has recently released a very important study on divestment, in which they review every other divestment campaign that has been launched, including one on adult materials, meaning pornography, alcohol, tobacco, South Africa. I've read the report. It's 70 pages long. I want to recommend it to everyone here. One of their results is this. In the case of tobacco in South Africa, the campaigns took some years to gather pace during the first wave, until universities such as Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia announced divestment. Previous research typically credits divestment by these prominent American universities as heralding a tipping point. That's what this really is about. It's not about financially damaging the corporations up front. It's about stigmatizing their behavior. And you go after the worst actors first. Absolutely. You screen them. You do the research. And it's messy, hard, and long research. I know. I remember the South Africa divestment apartheid campaign. I remember the charts and the columns and all of the principles. And you know what? When that campaign started, people said, it's too complicated. It's political. It's not ethical. Let's stay away from it. And the corporation here stayed away from it for a while. History has a way of trampling out the rapes of graft. It will do that. And I think in 20 or 30 years, we will see that happen in this industry. So that's what divestment can do. That's what it has done. Now, I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post about divestment. I did not say Harvard should immediately divest in all fossil fuel companies all at once. Absolutely not. It should do the kind of thing Professor Henderson is advocating, but it should have a plan. And that plan should be known. And the statement by Drew Faust and the corporation was vapid, because it did not talk about a real plan. It did not, all it said was address climate change. It did not talk about addressing an investment plan regarding climate change. That's what we really need, and we need some transparency about it. So yes, it's messy, yes, it's going to take years. Every second we don't do something about it, we are complicit in what Professor Henderson called the issue of our time. You know, eating meat that's an issue. Fishing out the ocean, that's an issue. Climate change is the overriding global issue that, if you're going to make a judgment, is more important than those issues. Because all of this is not about either or, it's about a spectrum of judgment. What's the most important issue? The most important issue for humanity, other than an asteroid hitting Earth, which we can't do too much about, or a plague that we can't fight, which we can do only something about, or a nuclear conflagration, those are the only three things that I can think about that are more important for humanity right now than this particular issue we're talking about today. And that's why I think it demands the kind of attention we're giving it.
Really have an opinion there. I just know that I find both arguments very compelling. I think divestment is a compelling argument, and I think very active engagement with management by shareholders is a very compelling argument too. And probably change can happen both ways. I've got to say, I'm a little more comfortable about what Jim Engel was just saying. And, you know, I got to tell you, I spend all of my time on this issue. So I don't know anybody, I mean, I see people like Jim McCarthy who's done an equal amount, but I devote my life to this issue. So this is not something that I think is unimportant. At the same time, I'm actually maybe squirm when Jim just said, this is the most important issue of our time. You know, I've been struggling over this and the question of time scale. Truth is, you know, to a lot of people in America, lower class, middle, lower class, who are struggling in a tough economy, they may be out of work, they're not privileged, they're really struggling to get good food on the table, struggling to get their kids through school, getting their kids to school every morning. The truth is that what we're talking about is if we were successful in pushing this change and stopping the use of fossil fuels, we are forcing all these people to pay real costs up front. And they're real costs. And the benefits will accrue a little bit sort of 30 to 60 years from now, but mostly 70, 100, 150 years from now. And by the way, for me, we should do it. It's essential because the Earth and generations, thousands of generations for the future depend on this, not to mention all of the natural world. So to me, it's a no-brainer. But to so quickly say this is the most important issue, I'm not sure I feel comfortable saying that to people who have real issues facing their lives. And this is a really difficult one because there are real sacrifices that we're asking people to make, to pay more money for energy in exchange for benefits that really don't accrue to them in the next 30 years. Nothing we do in changing emissions, by the way, in the next 30 years is going to really affect the climate system for 30 years. It's a much longer time scale effect. The climate system has huge inertia. The next 30 years is mostly dialed in. Now, does that mean we shouldn't do it? Absolutely not. We need to push politically to do it. But I'm just a little bit uncomfortable. In the same way that I'm actually uncomfortable, I'm 47 years old, almost 48. I'm a little uncomfortable telling 20-year-olds or 18-year-olds or 25-year-olds what to do or how to protest. I think it's great that you guys are protesting, and I'm a little wary of saying anything about what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing. That's why I think it's just great that you're doing it. But at the same time, I will tell you what I think some strategy should be. And I think back to when I was a college student when the apartheid protests were going on. I was at Yale, and Bart Giamatti was the president who didn't think we should divest. Bart was incredibly articulate, even more than Jim. And which is hard to imagine, but it's true. Bart Giamatti was really, for those of you who don't know, was president of Yale and then commissioner of baseball, banned Pete Rose. He was amazing, and you would hear him, but fundamentally, it felt like he was an old guy who didn't understand us. And I'm wary of that generational divide. But in terms of strategy, here's the problem. I really want to solve this problem of climate change. And I ask each of you, how do you think, what's the theory of change here? How are we actually going to solve this problem? And I've been thinking about this for a really long time. My own way of thinking about this is that it's going to come through political pressure that creates policies, that creates markets for development of new technology and innovation that ultimately becomes disruptive and the new technology just becomes cheaper and better than fossil fuels. I think the idea that we're going to just change the world's behavior and get everybody to stop using a cheaper, better energy alternative is unlikely. I wish that were the case. It just doesn't ring true to me. Not when I go to visit Asia. And it just doesn't seem like that's the way the world's going to change. And so to me, the most important thing is to develop conditions that promote innovation. And this is where divestment gets complicated. To me, I see a healthy US economy as a critical step towards this innovation. And this is where I'm torn, and I don't know the right answer. But, you know, protesting things like the Keystone Pipeline, I'm not convinced. oil pipelines are dirty and ugly, and what's happening up in Alberta is horrible. And at the same time, the economic success of the US over the next 50 years is critical, I believe, to whether we solve this problem or not. This is a really hard issue.
We don't need oil for that.
Because our economy depends, we're so completely addicted to oil. And I think everybody here, if you think hard about it, understands that. We're going to keep using oil. And unfortunately, we're going to use oil for a long, long time. I wish I could afford a Tesla. I can't.
Yeah, for Prius.
Prius isn't going to solve our problem. A Prius uses oil. And so, this is a really difficult problem. In the end, my own view is one like Rebecca's, and I talked to the divestment group last year about this. My own view is to be strategic. I think back to what I learned about the civil rights movement and what Rosa Parks did. Rosa Parks was not some woman who got tired on the bus and decided to not give up her seat. This was a very strategic plan to go after the busing because that was considered a strategic opportunity, a battle that they could win in the long fight towards desegregation. I think in this case, in this particular time, in this country, coal is at that point. And I urged the students last year, again, I don't want to tell anybody what to do, but my own view is that it would be very smart to focus on coal as a first step. Yes, all fossil fuels are immoral, and that means that we are all tainted. Everybody in this room is tainted because we all depend on them. But today, to say we should be stopping coal use in this country, why? Not just because it's high carbon, but because ultimately it would lead to the market conditions that would encourage innovation, would encourage investment in solar and wind, in energy storage, and all of the things we need to develop. And that, to me, is a recipe for moving forward.
Tim, would you like to weigh in on this question of the administration's plan to engage with shareholders as opposed to divest?
Yeah, I would. And I think to address the appropriateness of shareholder activism, I have to come back to the question that Rebecca asked about why the fossil fuel industry is different than, say, the fishing industry or the timber industry or employees or corporations that exploit their employees. And for that, we have to go back to what made divestment a national movement. The piece that Bill McKibben wrote about a year and a half ago about doing the math. And the basics of that were that there's something known as the carbon budget, which is there's only so much carbon that we can emit without condemning ourselves to an unlivable planet. And the proven reserves, the owned reserves of the fossil fuel industry are far above that amount of carbon that we can afford to emit. And those reserves of the fossil fuel industry are their assets. That's what their share prices are based on. Their economic value as a corporation is based on the assumption that they're going to dig all that up and burn it. That's their economic model. So I mean, first off, just from an investment perspective, it doesn't make sense to continue investing in a company whose economic model is incompatible with our goals of continuing to have a livable planet. That either we're going to win or they're going to win, but if they win, then we lose in a big way. So why would we want to attach our finances to that? But what that means is that what we're looking for when we say we want to keep that carbon in the ground is that we want the fossil fuel industry to abandon those assets, which makes shareholder activism somewhat ridiculous to run a resolution and get the owners of these corporations to say these assets that are on our balance sheets right now, we're going to abandon. We're going to leave them in the ground. That resolution would be absurd. And there's no way that those companies are going to voluntarily abandon their own financial assets. That will take pressure in order to make that happen. Looking at those numbers of the carbon budget and the proven assets of the fossil fuel industry is why McKibben and others like him, who have been dealing with this issue for a long time, came to this conclusion that the fossil fuel industry is actually our opponent here. That their interests are fundamentally opposed to our interests as society. That's why they're proposing this strategy of trying to undermine that moral authority of the fossil fuel industry, and that's what divestment does. It's a strategy to attack that political power of an industry. And I think it's one small step in terms of undermining that political power of the fossil fuel industry. I support a lot of different activities that try to undermine that political power. I think it'll take a lot of different approaches to chip away at that political power with its current stranglehold on our government. But I think, unless somebody has a silver bullet strategy that's going to take out that political power so effectively that divestment would be irrelevant, until there's that sort of strategy on the table, I'm still going to stand by divestment. And the idea is being thrown around here a lot that we're sort of on the same level as the fossil fuel industry. That all of us, since our lives depend on fossil fuels, or that we use them in some way, that we're sort of all on the same level and all in this together. That we've met the enemy and he is us. And frankly, I think that's not a very realistic attitude when you look at the economics of the fossil fuel industry. Fossil fuels is not a market that is a consumer-driven market. I mean, the reality of the fossil fuel market doesn't look like an Econ 101 chart of supply and demand. It is a politically driven market. When you take something like oil, we would go to the pump and pay $3.50, $4 a gallon.
So we've spoken for a bit about the effects of divestment and other strategies on climate change as an issue. Let's talk about the university for a little while. President Faust, in her statement about fossil fuel divestment, said, "We should also be clear-sighted about the risks that divestment could pose to the endowment's capacity to propel our important research and teaching mission." I'd love to hear from the panelists about what you feel about the effects of divestment on the university and whether those should be central concerns in this discussion. Why don't we start with Tim?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of speculation that divesting would hurt the university financially. And I think the mindset there is that these are the biggest and most profitable corporations in the world. Exxon is the biggest corporation that we have, and historically they've made a lot of profit. And so just sort of looking at that and saying, obviously they'll continue to do so, and they'll continue to be a good investment. We don't want to turn away from a good investment. But I think we need to acknowledge that it is a changing world, and that those companies that have been profitable in the past may or may not be profitable in the future. I mean, one of the things we know for sure about climate change is that things are going to get shaken up, that there will be unpredictability. We might not know everything of what that's going to look like, but things are going to look different. And so we don't really know whether or not there will be a negative financial impact of divestment. And it's too early to really make a judgment based on the endowments that have already divested. I mean, there have been some reports based on like the first 6 months or the first year of those endowments that shows that they're doing just fine, or even better than they were before. But that's not really enough of a time frame to make that judgment. I got my degree in economics, and one of the fundamental things that I learned is that economists are not nearly as good at predicting the future as they think they are. So I think we have to acknowledge that any assumptions about what this will do to our financial stability as our endowment are just that. They are just assumptions. And I think that's why it comes down more to a moral argument and also a political argument of which side are we going to be on. And I think that really is the question of which side we're going to be on. In Drew Faust's statement, she said that she doesn't want to use the endowment for political purposes or for taking a stand on a political issue. But But that money is not neutral. That money is going into companies that are taking a very strong political stand. I mean, to make that money neutral, you have to pull it out of any company that tries to influence our political process. And that's certainly not happening. So I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we are taking a stand on one side or another, as we do with any issue. There is no real neutrality on a moral issue, especially one that involves the powerful versus the powerless. So we're always taking that stand.
Professor Schreck, how do you feel about this question of the effects of divestment, the potential effects on the university?
Disrupt the global economy and lower the value substantially. And so the way large institutions deal with risk is by hedging. And so you invest on both sides to make sure that, and that's a very common way that financial managers deal with risk. My understanding is it's very difficult to deal with that particular risk without actually investing in the oil industry to profit from a huge price spike, because there are going to be other industries that are going to get squashed by that. So in terms of a way to deal with risk, I believe the financial managers I've spoken to who say this is a very important strategy and it's a real risk to the portfolio, and it's not going to be measured by one or two portfolios that have divested a year or two ago. We haven't seen that, right? The question is, what happens when the price spike hits? Who ends up losing 30% of their endowment and who only loses 10%? And that's sort of the metric and this is why this is done, as far as I understand it. So I think there really are costs, and it is in President Faust's words, there are real trade-offs. So, reduced return on the endowment, or more risk that the endowment takes and then gets hit by some financial crisis, ultimately does mean less money to hire new faculty, to build more buildings, to renovate, to take on more students, to offer more financial aid. Money is fungible. It's real money. But to me, that's not really at the center of what this is about. So it's not critical. To me, it's really a question of what's your theory of change. And when I was listening to Tim, it sounded like your theory of change is that you see that by divesting and by protesting, we're going to convince these fossil fuel companies to leave their reserves in the ground.
No.
And, well, okay, I'm sorry, that's what I heard.
No, I think I said specifically that we're never going to convince them to do it.
So I actually think it's essential that we do, but the way I think it's going to happen is by eventually leading to technologies that will ultimately leave those reserves in the ground. I also want to just comment on the Bill McKibben do the math thing, because as a climate scientist, that makes me a little uncomfortable. There is no safe amount of carbon. Let's just put that out, okay? There is no amount of carbon that we can add that will be safe. If there is a safe level, I suspect we passed it long ago. Everything from this point on is unsafe. It just gets worse and worse.
Bill would agree with you.
There may be thresholds, there may be tipping points. We don't know where they are. It's like landmines. So going forward, the probability of hitting one gets more and more bad. If you look at the reserves, what's interesting is actually oil and gas don't have that much. If you look, I published a paper in Science about 7 years ago that showed all of the fossil fuel proven reserves in units of gigatons of carbon. And what's amazing is, 80% of it is in the coal industry, which is sort of interesting. And if you actually look at values in terms of the value of those reserves, ultimately they're losing value because they're valuing their companies, as you say, based on what's in the ground. What's interesting is the coal companies aren't being valued very much. So, ExxonMobil's market cap right now is about $400 billion. They are about 3% of world oil production and a smaller fraction than that of oil reserves. Peabody Coal in the US has 50% of US coal reserves, which is something like 15% of world coal reserves. So that's a really big number. Their market cap right now it was down at like $3.5 billion. It's I think around 5 or 6 billion right now. 5 or 6 billion compared to 400 billion. So actually, per ton of carbon that their reserve is, we're not valuing those reserves worth anything, which is sort of interesting. that's partly strategically why I've been urging to focus. You know, the idea is not that burning a ton of carbon, releasing a ton of carbon in oil is any less immoral than releasing a ton of carbon in coal. It's purely, but my own view is you don't get there by demonizing the oil industry right now. Just strategically, I want to use the oil industry to kill the coal industry. And 20 years from now, when we shut down every single coal plant in this country that doesn't use carbon capture and storage, and by the way, we still have 40% of our electricity from coal. That's a long, by the way, there's some people who say, oh, we're already doing that. No. We are a long way from shutting down the coal industry in this country. So we have a huge fight ahead of us for the next 20 years. But once we've actually done that, and by the way, most people would say 20 years to shut down the coal industry in this country is hallucinating. But I'm hallucinating. I want to do that. And then 20 years from now, let's talk about how we kill the oil and gas industry. But you do it strategically. You don't necessarily open up 3 fronts in the first battle of a 100-year war. And that's, to me, the way I've been thinking about it.
So I just took a look at the time, and it's getting a little bit late, so I think we'll put a hold on the questions for now and ask the panelists to weigh in with any closing thoughts if you have them. And again, keeping in mind that this discussion is by no means over, but rather just beginning. So why don't we start with Professor Henderson?
So I would like to thank everyone for inviting me to be here to say how important and central I think this conversation is. I think the most important issue is, in the short term, is to bring more people into this room. This should be more central to the Harvard conversation. And to say that I agree completely with Dan that I think demonizing the entire fossil fuel industry is a mistake right now, but I do think that going after coal in a thoughtful and appropriate way makes a lot of sense.
I express my thanks too also to the students who organized this and to UC Council. When I wrote about this issue recently, I said at the least Harvard should have a real strategy for doing this over a period of time. I would like to see, since we're here to talk about divestment in Harvard, I'd like to see such an actual strategy. I didn't see that in the statement that was issued by the president in the name of the corporation. Instead, I saw a great deal of concern, which I think is genuine. And I saw a great deal of reasons given not to divest, which to me have varying degrees of unconvincingness in some ways. On the other hand, I think sudden divestment of every fossil fuel stock is not the way to go in all likelihood. It has to be tactical, and it has to go on and on. But there has to be something other than simply a statement of, we are not going to divest. Because that is an extraordinary statement. I guess I'd put it this way. I think it made the coal companies very happy. I think it made the fossil fuel companies happy when they read that statement. I think it probably pleased them. They had missed a bullet, or at least a little stone. But David did kill Goliath. Big changes do happen, and they come about from people whose convictions will not give up. They will find the right strategy eventually. And I think you people who are young, there's where the hope lies. I think you will find it. I know you will, because you're committed to do it. Thanks.
I think part of our overarching goal needs to be empowering people to take ownership over their own society. Not just in terms of winning this battle, in terms of being able to make the transition from the fossil fuel economy to a clean energy economy, but also in terms of being able to deal with the inevitable consequences of climate change that are already in the pipeline. We're going to need the kind of society where people can face those consequences that are coming at us in a way in which we are empowered to create the kind of society that we want. And so I'm fundamentally uncomfortable with strategies that say we need these corporations on our side, that the only way we're going to win is to get the right corporate master in charge of us. And that the choice that we face as citizens is who's going to be the friendlier corporate master for us. I'm fundamentally opposed to telling people that that's the choice that we have to make. I think we need to be moving towards a system where we say that we don't need corporations to be masters of human beings, that we can be empowered to create our own kind of society. And I think whatever strategy we use, whatever tactics we use right now, they need to be working towards that long-term goal of empowering people. And we're digging out of a big hole here, but I think we've made progress in that direction. I mean, I was born the year that Ronald Reagan took office, and so the reality in my lifetime has always been that people are weak and corporations and government are powerful, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And in the last few years, we've had some examples of people power that have made people power realistic again. And we need a lot more of that. We need more and more faith in people power if we're going to meet the challenges that lie ahead of us. And all of our strategies need to increase that faith in people power. You know, Rosa Parks has been brought up a couple times, and I think it's important to remember that in addition to whatever strategy she was using, like everyone else in the civil rights movement that was pushing the boundaries, she always had comfortable liberals saying, yeah, but just slow down. Yeah, we agree with you in principle, but just back off a little bit. Just don't push so hard, just don't be so confrontational. I mean, that's the entire point of the letter from a Birmingham jail, was a response to comfortable liberals that were telling Dr. King to just cool down a little bit, just take it easy a little bit. That we're always going to have that pressure telling us, yes, but not so fast, not so far. And if we're going to really meet those challenges, we need to keep pushing. We need to keep being more confrontational and keep having an ever greater faith in our own power to shape the world that we want to see.
Professor Schreck?
So I like what Tim just said, although my reading of history is just a little bit different. I think he's exactly right. We need more people like Tim pushing, being radical, pushing. And I'm very taken by that letter from Birmingham jail. And I think that's exactly right. At the same time, those comfortable liberals were really important in helping LBJ pass the Voter Rights Act. And some of the important things that LBJ was able to do wasn't because of Martin Luther King and the radicals. It was actually because of a large population that was willing to support LBJ, despite some of the horrible things he did in Vietnam. And so this is a complicated thing. You know, Marshall Gans, who's kind of been inspiring to me in the Kennedy School, Marshall reminded me of how fractured and contentious the civil rights movement was, and how many different people, people thought of Martin Luther King as a bit of a compromiser and soft, right? He wasn't black power. And frankly, in every movement there's a variety of different views, and they each play important roles to getting to the end. And so I think the most important thing is to do something right now.